Hello. Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Happy Monday, everyone. How are we all doing? And we all, I think just me. That's okay. People will come in. Um, I had a decent day. Hold on. I woke up and I wrote on stream, so live proof that it happened. But I actually started today with a nice little walk around my neighborhood. Came home, ate breakfast, streamed, and then I went to work. And then I came home, and then I Uber Eats delivered a little bit actually, because my financial insecurity has just reached a place of like action. um, so yeah, did a little Uber Eats delivering. And then I came home. I had dinner, and now I'm here doing a stream for you all. So happy to be here. And yeah, as usual, let me know your high, low, and kudos in the chat. Also, today I'm going to try to stream for a little bit longer because this book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, I've had it checked out of the library for so long that they're not letting me renew it. Now, I did speak to one of my library friends today, and they said, we'll just override the system for you and renew it anyway. That being said, I don't think I should keep renewing the book. I've had it out for a while. So I believe it's time to return it. But that being said, I do plan on reading just a little bit more than I have been every stream. So today I'm going to read like 31 or 32 pages. So yeah, that's that. So in the last section of chapter, what was it? 7? Yeah, chapter 7. It says, that we were cruising on the surface of the Atlantic. They're starting their trek across the surface of the Atlantic. Yeah. Starting across the Atlantic. Okay, let's get into it. Yay. Okay, so this is chapter 8, Vigo Bay. The Atlantic, a vast expanse of water whose surface covers 25 million square miles, 9,000 miles long, with an average width of 27,000. Nope, 2,700. An important sea particularly unknown to the ancients, except perhaps to the Carthaginians, whose ancient Hollanders who, in their commercial wanderings, sailed the west coasts of Europe and Africa. An ocean whose parallel winding shores embrace an immense perimeter, and which is fed by the largest rivers of the world, the St. Lawrence, the Mississippi, the Amazon, the Plata, the Orinoco, the Niger, the Senegal, the Elbe, the Loire, and the Rhine, all pouring their waters into it from the most civilized as well as the most primitive countries. A magnificent plain, incessantly plowed by ships of every nation, protected by all the flags of the world, ending in those two dangerous capes dreaded by seafarers, Cape Horn and Cape of Tempests. The Nautilus cuts through its waters with its prow after having sailed almost 10,000 leagues in 3.5 months, a distance greater than the great circle of the earth. Where we are going now, and what had the future in store for us. On leaving the Strait of Gibraltar, the Nautilus had headed for the open sea. It now emerged on the surface again, and so once more we were able to enjoy our daily strolls on the platform. I went up immediately, accompanied by Ned Land and Conseil. At a distance of 12 miles, the vague outline of Cape St. Vincent appeared. This cape forms the southwestern tip of the Spanish peninsula. A strong wind was blowing from the south. The sea was high and surging. It beat against the Nautilus, which rocked violently, and it was practically impossible to stand on the platform, since enormous waves kept crashing against the ship. We went below after having taken a few breaths of fresh air. I went back to my room, and Conseil returned to his cabin. The Canadian, however, looking somewhat preoccupied, followed me. Our rapid passage across the Mediterranean had not permitted him to carry out his plans, and he was unable to disguise his keen disappointment. When the door of my room closed behind us, he sat down and looked at me in silence. "I understand how you feel, Ned," I said, "but you are not to blame. Under the circumstances, even the thought of escaping would have been an act of folly." Ned Land did not answer. His pursed lips and the frown on his brow indicated clearly that he was obsessed by a single thought. "Look," I continued, "let us not give up hope yet. We are now sailing along the coast of Portugal. France and England are not far off, where we could easily find refuge. Now, if the Nautilus, on leaving the Strait of Gibraltar, had headed south, and if I had sailed in regions where there are no continents, I would share your fears. But we know now that Captain Nemo does not shun well-traveled seas, and within a few days, I think you will be able to act with more security." Ned Land set his gaze on me, stared, opened his pursed lips, and said, "It's all set for this evening." I sat up, startled. I was, I must confess, totally unprepared for this. I wanted to answer the Canadian, but I could not utter a word. "We agreed to wait for a suitable opportunity," continued Ned Land. "That opportunity has come. The evening will be only a few miles off the Spanish coast. The night is still dark. The wind is blowing in from the sea. You have given me your word, Monsieur Aronnax, and I am counting on you." I continued to remain silent. The Canadian rose, came over to me, and said, "Tonight, at 9 o'clock, I have alerted Conseil. At that time, Captain Nemo will not be in his room, probably asleep. Will be in his room, probably asleep. Neither the mechanics nor the crew will be able to see us. Conseil and I will go to the central stairway. You, Monsieur Aronnax, will remain in the library close by, waiting for my signal. The oars, the masts, and the sail are in the dinghy. I have even stored some provisions in it. I have a wrench to unscrew the bolts which hold the dinghy to the hull of the Nautilus. Everything is ready for this evening." "The sea is rough," I said. "I agree," replied the Canadian, "but we must risk that. Our freedom is worth that risk. The dinghy, as you know, is sturdy, and a few miles, with wind behind us, should offer no serious problem. Who knows? Tomorrow the Nautilus may be 100 leagues away in the open sea. If everything works out well, within 2 or 3 hours we should be somewhere on dry land, or we'll be dead." May God be with us. This evening, 9 o'clock, monsieur. The Canadian withdrew, leaving me dumbfounded. I had imagined that I would have had time to reflect and to discuss this matter when the occasion arose. My stubborn companion gave me no time for this. But after all, what could I have said to him? Ned Land was right 100 times over. It was just a chance, and he was taking advantage of it. Could I go back on my word and be responsible for the future of my companions for personal and selfish reasons? Couldn't Captain Nemo easily take us beyond the reach of all land on the very next day? Just then, a loud hissing sound made me realize that the tanks had been filled and the Nautilus drove beneath the waves of the Atlantic. I remained in my room. I avoided the captain for fear that my deep emotions might betray me. It was a very depressing day for me. I was torn between the desire to regain my freedom and the reluctance to abandon that admirable Nautilus, leaving, besides, my studies of the seas unfinished. How could I leave that ocean, my Atlantic, as I had been fond to calling it, without having explored its deepest waters, without having discovered all those detailed mysteries that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific had revealed to me? How could I end abruptly my romance in the middle of my story and interrupt my dream at the most exciting moment? During the unhappy hours that followed, I sometimes imagined myself and my companions safe on land, sometimes hoping, in spite of my reason, that something would happen to prevent Ned Land from carrying out his plans. I went into the saloon on 2 occasions. I wanted to consult the compass. I wanted to see whether the direction of the Nautilus was bringing us nearer or farther away from the coast. No, the Nautilus continued to remain in Portuguese waters. She was heading north, sailing along the shores of the ocean. There was no choice but to resign myself to the inevitable and make ready to escape. My luggage was not heavy, neither were my notes. As for Captain Nemo, I wondered what he would think of our escape, my anxieties, and what harm it might perhaps cause him, and what he would do in the case that we succeeded, and what if we failed. Certainly I had no reason to complain about his conduct. On the contrary, never had hospitality been more open to this. He could not accuse me of being ungrateful for leaving him. We were not bound to him by an oath or even a promise. He was dependent on the force of circumstances to keep us on board and not have any word of ours. His frank admission that he intended to keep us on board justified any attempt we might make in order to escape. I had not seen the captain since our visit to the Isle of Santorin. What fate would bring us face to face before our escape? I both desired and feared it. I listened to see whether I could hear his footsteps to the room next to mine. Not a sound. The room must have been deserted. If I were to make a guess right now, I think Ned Land is going to escape solo. And I think Arana is going to chicken out and want to stay on board, and Conceal seems to just love Arana, so I think he's going to stay behind. But I don't know. We'll see. We shall see. All right. I kept asking myself whether this strange person was really on board the ship. His ship. Since that night, when the dinghy had left the Nautilus and had gone on that mysterious mission, my ideas about him had changed somewhat. I thought that Captain Nemo had maintained relations of some kind or other with those on land, regardless of what he said. Did he ever leave the Nautilus? He had often disappeared for weeks without my ever meeting him. What did he do on these occasions? Could it be that he was carrying out some secret missions, the nature of which escaped me? Had I been mistaken in thinking he roamed the seas because of his hatred for mankind? Thanks, Colin. All these ideas and 1,000 others assailed me at once. The field of conjecture had no limits in the strange situation in which we found ourselves. I felt an unbeatable uneasiness. That day of waiting seemed an eternity, and in my impatience, the hours struck very slowly. As always, my dinner was served in my room. I ate very little, for I was too disturbed. Couldn't be me. I rose from the table at 7 o'clock. 120 minutes, I counted them, still remained before I was to join Ned Land. My restlessness became more intense. My pulse beat violently, and I could not remain still. I paced up and down, hoping that moving to and fro would calm my disturbed mind. The prospect of failing or dying in our daring enterprise was the least of my worries, but at the thought of having our plans discovered before we got away, when I thought of being brought back to the presence of Captain Nemo, angry or, what was worse, grieved by my desertion, my heart beat faster. I wanted to see the saloon for the last time. I went down and entered that museum when I had passed so many useful and pleasant hours. I gazed at all those riches and all those treasures like a man who, exiled for life, is leaving, never to return. Those marvels of nature, whose artistic masterpieces, along which I had devoted so much of my life lately, I was now about to abandon forever. I should have liked to gaze once more at the waters of the Atlantic through the windows, but the panels were sealed, and a steel mantle separated me from that ocean that I still did not know. As I wandered about the room, I drew near the door that opened into the captain's room. To my astonishment, the door was ajar. I drew back. If Captain Nemo were in this room, he could see me. However, hearing no noise, I drew near. The room was empty. I pushed the door open and stepped in. It had that same severe, monastic look. Just then, some etchings hanging on the wall, which I had not noticed on my first visit, drew my attention. They were portraits of great men in history, whose lives had been entirely dedicated to a great human ideal. Kosciuszko, the hero whose dying words were Finis Polinae, Botzaris, the Leonidas of modern Greece, O'Connell, the defender of Ireland, Washington, the founder of the American Union, Manin, the Italian patriot, Lincoln, shot by a defender of slavery, and finally, that martyr of the emancipation of the Negro race, John Brown, hanging on the gallows, so realistically drawn by Victor Hugo. What bond existed between those heroic souls and the soul of Captain Nemo? Could I finally unravel the mystery of his life and this group of portraits? Was he a champion of oppressed peoples, the liberator of enslaved races? Had he played a role in political or social uprisings in the century? Had he been one of those heroes of the American Civil War, a tragic war but forever glorious? The clock struck 8. The first stroke of the bell hammer startled me and shook me away from my dream. I trembled as if an invisible eye had penetrated the innermost secrets of my thoughts and rushed out of the room. My glance fell on my compass. We were still heading in a northerly direction. The log indicated a moderate speed, the manometer a depth of about 60 feet. Events were certainly propitious to the plans of the Canadian. I went back to my room and put on warm clothes, sea boots, otter fur cap, byssus overcoat lined with sealskin. I was ready. I waited. Only the vibrations of the propeller interrupted the deep silence that reigned on board. I listened carefully. Would not a sudden cry inform me that Ned Land had been caught in his attempt to escape? I was seized by a mortal dread. I tried in vain to regain my calm. A few minutes before 9 o'clock, I pressed my ear to the captain's door. No sound. I left my room and went back to the saloon. It was dimly lit and empty. I opened the door that communicated with the library. The same dim light, the same solitude. I went and stood by the door that led to the central stairway and waited for the signal. At that moment, the vibrations of the propeller diminished noticeably and then stopped altogether. Why had the Nautilus stopped completely? Should this thwart Ned Land's plans? I could not say. The silence now was broken only by the beating of my heart. Suddenly, I felt a slight shock, and I realized that the Nautilus had come to rest on the ocean bed. My uneasiness increased. The captain's signal did not come. I desperately wanted to join Ned Land in order to persuade him to postpone his attempt. I felt that we were no longer sailing under normal conditions. Just then, the door of the large saloon opened and Captain Nemo appeared. He saw me, and without preliminaries, "Ah, Monsieur le Professeur," he said in a friendly tone. "I have been looking for you. Do you know the history of Spain?" A person would not know the history of his country thoroughly, and still not remember a single event if he were placed in the same circumstances I was. My mind was so troubled I could not think clearly, and could not utter a word. "Well," Captain Nemo insisted, "did you hear my question? Do you know the history of Spain?" "Very sketchily," I replied. "Indeed, even the learned," said Captain, "do not know. So pray, be seated," he added. "I am going to tell you a strange episode of that history." The captain stretched out on a divan, and mechanically, I sat down next to him in the dim light. Monsieur le Professeur," he said, "listen to me carefully. This story will interest you in one respect, for it will answer a question that you have undoubtedly been unable to resolve." "I am listening, Captain," I said, not knowing quite what he had in mind, and wondering whether this incident had any bearing on our plans to escape. "Monsieur le Professeur," continued Captain Nemo, "with your permission, let us go back to 1701. You will certainly remember that at that time your king, Louis the... 14th? Believing that a mere gesture of his could bury the Pyrenees, had imposed his grandson, the Duke of Anjou, and on the Spanish. This prince, who reigned rather badly under the name of Philip V, had to face considerable opposition to his foreign policy. In fact, that previous year, the royal houses of Holland, Austria, and England had concluded an allianceship with Hague, and the object of forcibly depriving Philip V of the crown of Spain in order to place it under the head of the Archduke, to whom they prematurely gave the name of Charles III. Spain was forced to resist this coalition, but she was almost without an army or a navy. However, Spain was not without money, provided, of course, that her galleons loaded with gold and silver from America could reach her ports. Toward the end of the year 1702, Spain was waiting for a rich convoy, which France was escorting with a fleet of 23 vessels, commanded by Admiral de Chateau-Renaud. This convoy was not protected by the ships of the coalition sailing the high seas of the Atlantic. This convoy was supposed to dock at Cadiz, but the admiral hearing that the English fleet was cruising in this area, decided to head for a French port. The Spanish commanders on the convoy protested against the decision. They insisted on being taken to a Spanish port, and if not to Cadiz, then the Bay of Vigo, located on the northwest coast of Spain, which was not then blockaded. Admiral de Château-Renaud was weak enough to yield to their demands, and the galleons entered the Vigo Bay. Unfortunately, this bay had an open harbor which cannot be defeated. It was necessary to unload the galleons quickly before the arrival of the combed fleets of the coalition. They would have sufficient time to accomplish this, and if a miserable question of rivalry had not arisen. Are you following the chain of events, Professor? Yes, of course, I said, still not knowing why I was given this history lesson. Permit me to continue. This is what happened. The merchants of Cadiz had the sole privilege of receiving all merchandise that came from the West Indies. Unloading ingots at Vigo Bay was, therefore, a violation of their rights. They complained to Madrid, and they obtained an order from the weak Philip V, requesting that the convoy cease unloading and that the fleet remain sequestered at Vigo Bay until the enemy fleet had sailed away. Just as the decision was being enforced, on the 22nd of October 1702, the English vessels arrived in Vigo Bay. Admiral de Château-Renaud, despite his inferior forces, fought bravely, and when he saw the riches of the convoy were going to fall into the hands of the enemy, he set fire to the galleons, scuttled them, and they sank with all their immense treasures. Captain Nemo paused. I must confess that I still could not see why this story should be of any interest to me. Well, I asked him. Well, Monsieur Aronnaud, Captain Nemo answered, we are in Vigo Bay, and it is entirely up to you to unravel this mystery if you are interested. The captain stood up and motioned me to follow. I had now had the time to recover. I obeyed. The saloon was in darkness, and though the transparent panels, the waters of the sea were glittering. I looked out. For a half-mile around the Nautilus, the waters glittered under the gleams of our searchlight. The bottom of the sea was clear, clean, and sandy. Members of the crew, in their diving suits, were busy clearing the blackened debris of rotted casks and chests out of wrecks. The ground was covered with bars of gold, silver, piles of coins and jewels taken out of casks and chests. Loaded with that precious booty, the men returned to the Nautilus, deposited their burdens, and went back to that inexhaustible mine to fish for more gold and silver. I was beginning to understand. This was the scene of the Battle of the 22nd of October, 1702. In this very spot, the galleons, laden with treasure for the Spanish government, had sunk to the bottom. It was here that Captain Nemo came to fill his own coffers with the millions that he had carried aboard the Nautilus to take care of his needs. It was for him, and for him alone, that America had delivered her precious metals. He was the only heir, and there were no sharers to these treasures, snatched from the Incas, as well as the people conquered by Hernan Cortés. Did you know, Monsieur le Professeur, he said, sailing, that these seas contained such treasures? I knew, I replied, that someone calculating that there were 2 million tons worth of silver lying around these waters. That is quite true. However, it would cost more than that to bring these treasures to the surface. But all I have to do is to harvest what other men have lost. And this is true not only of this bay, but of thousands of other places, which I have recorded on my map. Do you understand now why I am a billionaire? Okay, flex. I do indeed, Captain. I should tell you, however, that by doing what you are doing here at Vigo Bay, you are merely forestalling the works of a rival company. What company, may I ask? A company that has obtained the privilege to search for these sunken galleons for the Spanish government. The shareholders are lured by the possibility of acquiring enormous profits, for the value of these riches is estimated to be about 500 million francs. 500 million! Captain Nemo exclaimed. That was much, yes, but not any longer. In that case, I said, a warning to the shareholders would be an act of charity. Although who can tell whether such a warning would be well received? But gamblers regret most of the loss of their money, but the loss of their foolish hopes. But nevertheless, I pity them less than the thousands of needy people who might have benefited from a fair distribution of this wealth. Now, however, these riches will never benefit them. I had no sooner uttered this regret that I realized it must have offended Captain Nemo. Never benefit them, he replied, animatedly. Do you think, Monsieur, that these riches are lost to them because I gather them? Do you for one moment think that I go to the trouble of collecting all these treasures just for my own benefit? What makes you think that I do not make good use of them? Do you think that I am unaware that there are human beings who are suffering, people who are oppressed in this world, wretches who need to be comforted, victims to be avenged? Don't you understand? Captain Nemo stopped suddenly, sorry, perhaps, for having talked too much. Whatever the reasons may have been that had driven him to seek his independence under the seas, he had remained a man, in spite of it all. His heart was still beating for suffering humanity, and his immense charity was given not only to the oppressed races, but to the unfortunate individual as well. And I finally realized that those millions that I had seen while we were cruising around the waters of Crete had been delivered to the insurgents of that unhappy island. I'm wondering how he knew that in that moment. Anyway, that was the end of chapter 8. That was a very entertaining chapter. Yeah, one of the best I feel like we've read in a while. I feel like there was some real action there, big decision making. Although, like, I'm guessing, I feel like what happened there, if I'm not mistaken, is that Nemo kind of pulled Arnaud into just like a conversation about, not even a conversation, like a little lecture about the history of Spain, and then they started an argument. And I'm gonna guess that while this was going on, Ned Land and maybe Conseil have escaped the ship. If I were to make a guess, I would feel like maybe that happened during that time, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I feel like I kind of got a spoiler for this chapter while I was looking at the pages. And I'm really freaking stoked about it. So, yeah. I won't tell you though. You get the mystery to be unveiled for you in chapter 9, The Lost Continent. Okay. Here we go. The next morning, February 19th, that's my birthday. The Canadian came into my room. I was expecting his visit. He looked very disappointed. Well, monsieur, he said. Oh. Yeah, okay. Well, Ned, I'm afraid luck was against us yesterday. Yes, it certainly was. That damn captain had to stop just at the very moment we were ready to escape. Okay, so they waited for him and didn't leave. You see, Ned, he had to transact some business with his banker. His banker? Or should I say, his bank? I mean, his ocean, where his wealth is safer than it could be in a state treasury. I then told the Canadian what had happened the day before, with the secret hope of bringing him around to the idea of not deserting the captain. But the only effect this had on him was to fill him with regret that he had himself not been able to make a stroll through the Battle of the Vigo for his own personal benefit. After all, he said, we're not done yet. Our harpoon missed its target, that's all. Next time we shall score a bullseye. And this evening, perhaps. What is our course now? I asked. I don't know, replied Nemo. Well, at midday, we shall have our bearings. The Canadian returned to Conseil. When I was dressed, I went into the saloon. The compass was far from reassuring, and the Nautilus was heading south-southwest, so that we were turning our backs on Europe. I waited impatiently for our bearings to be marked on the chart. At about 11:30, the tanks were emptied, and we came up to the surface. I rushed up to the platform. Ned was already there. There was no land in sight, nothing but the vast open sea. There were a few sails on the horizon, probably boats going out as far as Cape San Roque in search of a favorable wind to take them around to the Cape of Good Hope. The sky was overcast, and there was a windstorm in the making. Ned was funny and tried... Oh, funny. Jesus. Ned was fuming and tried to pierce through that misty horizon. He still hoped that behind all the fog he might catch a glimpse of some land he longed for. At midday, the sun came out for an instant, and the second in command took advantage of the improved visibility to take his bearings. The sea was becoming rough. The hatch was closed, and we dived once more. An hour later, on consulting the chart, I saw that the position of the Nautilus was at longitude 16 degrees 17 west by latitude 30 degree 22 north and 150 leagues from the nearest land. There could be no thought of escaping, and the reader can well imagine the Canadian's fury when I informed him of our position. As far as I concerned, I did not take it much to heart. On the contrary, I felt if a weight had been taken off my mind, and I was now able to resume my normal routine with relative calm. That evening, at about 11 o'clock, I received the most unexpected visit from Captain Nemo, who asked me most graciously whether I was tired from having stayed up so late the night before. I told him I was not. In that case, Monsieur Aronnax, I would like to suggest a very interesting excursion. By all means do, Captain. So far, you have explored the depths of the sea only during the day and in the sunlight. Would you like to explore these depths in the darkness of night? That would please me very much indeed. I warn you, however, this excursion will be tiring. It will be a long one. You will have to climb a mountain, and the paths are not in a good state on repair. What are you telling me, Captain? Only whets my curiosity. You have only to lead. Come with me then, Professor. We will go and put on our diving suits. When we got into the dressing room, I noticed that neither of my companions nor any member of the crew were to accompany us on this trip. Captain Nemo had not even suggested taking Ned or Conseil with us. A few seconds later, we had put on our suits. Air tanks, filled to the brim, were harnessed onto our backs, but the electric equipment was not included. I mentioned this to the captain. We will not need it, he replied. I thought I had not heard him correctly, but I was unable to repeat my remark because the captain's head had already disappeared inside his metal headgear. So I had finished arranging my harness, and someone put a spiked walking stick in my hand. A few minutes later, after going through the usual procedure, we set foot on the bottom of the Atlantic at about 10,000 feet down. Midnight was approaching. The waters were pitch black. However, Captain Nemo pointed to a reddish glow of light shining in the distance, about 2 miles away. What that beacon was, what made it glow, and how it could shine so brightly through those waters, I could not possibly have guessed. Nevertheless, it did light our way, however dimly, but I soon got used to that strange semi-darkness, and I realized how useless our own light would have been. Captain Nemo and I walked together in the direction of that glimmer of light. The flat ground rose imperceptibly. We kept walking along with great strides, helped by our sticks. Our progress was slow, however, since our feet kept sticking in a sort of thick mud and a growth of seaweed dotted with flat rocks. As we walked along, I began to hear a kind of pattering noise above my head. Sometimes that noise grew in intensity and became a continuous crackling. I soon discovered what was causing it. Sorry. I soon discovered what was causing it. It was a very heavy rain, falling and pattering on the surface of the water. And instinctively, I thought I was going to get drenched with water, although immersed in it. I couldn't help laughing at that weird idea. However, there was nothing strange about this because when one is in the water wearing a diving suit, one is not aware of the water. One merely feels that he is in an atmosphere denser than that on land. After we had walked a half an hour, the ground became rocky. It became rocky. Medusae, microscopic crustacean, and pennachules made that soil shine with a faint glow of phosphorescence. I could make out the outlines of heaps of rocks covered with a carpet of millions of zoophytes and masses of seaweed. I often slipped on this carpet, and without my iron stick, I would have fallen more than once. When I turned around, I could still see the light of the Nautilus fading in the distance. Those piles of stone I had once mentioned were laid out on that bed of the ocean with a certain regularity that I found hard to explain. I noticed gigantic furrows which faded away in the distant darkness and whose length could not be measured. There were other details also that I could not account for. I had the impression that my heavy leaden soles, as I walked along, were crunching a layer of bones that made a dry, crackling sound. What could this vast plain I was treading be? I wanted to ask the captain, but his sign language, which he used to communicate with his crew on the underwater excursions, was still incomprehensible to me. Those piles of stone I had just mentioned were laid out on the bed of the ocean with a certain regularity hard to explain. I noticed gigantic furrows which faded away in the distant darkness and whose length could not be measured. I think I already read this to me. I'm just going to read it again, though. There were other details, also, that I could not account for. I had the impression that my heavy laden soles, as I walked along, were crunching a layer of bones that made a dry crackling sound. What could this vast plain I was treading be? I wanted to ask the captain, but his sign language, which he used to communicate with his crew on the underwater excursions, was still incomprehensible to me. Meanwhile, the rosy glow that guided us was growing brighter and lighter up the horizon. I was greatly intrigued by the presence of this fiery beacon under the sea. Could it be an electrical phenomenon? Was I producing a natural phenomena unknown to the scientists on Earth? Or, the thought occurred to me, did the hand of man have anything to do with it? Could the hand of man be responsible for the conflagration? Was I going to meet, in those depths, the friends and companions of Captain Nemo, living like him a strange existence, and whom he had come to visit? Would I meet, in those depths, a whole colony of exiles who, weary of the misery of terrestrial life, had sought refuge and independence at the very bottom of the sea? These were the mad, incredible ideas that ran through my mind as I became more and more bewildered by the marvels that unfolded before my eyes. I would not have been surprised to find one of those cities Captain Nemo dreamed of at the bottom of the sea. Our path was becoming brighter and brighter. The whitish glow came out from the peak of the mountain about 800 feet high. What I saw was just the reflection produced by the crystal clarity of the water. The actual source of this inexplicable light was on the other side of the mountain. Okay, give me a second. I just want to see where the end of this chapter is. 305. Okay. Captain Nemo advanced unhesitatingly through the maze of rocks that crisscrossed the bottom of the ocean. Evidently, he knew this dark road quite well, having often traveled it, so that there was no danger of him becoming lost. I followed him with unshakable confidence. I thought of him as one of those spirits of the sea, and as he walked in front of me, I admired his tall stature, outlined against the background of a glowing horizon. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when we reached the first slopes of the mountain. But before beginning to climb, we had to walk along some difficult paths through the vast expanse of brushwood. Yes, it was a forest of dead trees, without leaves and without sap, petrified by the water of the sea, dominated here and there by gigantic pines. It was like a colliery still standing, whose trees were still held by the roots of the sunken soil, while their branches, like fine traceries cut out of black pepper, stood in bold relief against the watery background. Let the reader imagine a forest in the Hartz Mountains, with trees clinging to the slopes of its steep rocks, but completely immersed in the sea of water. The paths were cluttered with seaweed and fucus. I got distracted. Among which swarmed innumerable kinds of crustacean. I walked on, climbing over rocks, stepping over fallen tree trunks, breaking seaweed slung between one tree and another, frightening fish that flew from branch to branch. I was so carried away that I felt no fatigue, and followed with my what the hell is this word? Indefatigable guide. Wow. What a spectacle. How can I describe it? How can I describe a vision of those rocks and those trees standing upright in those waters, their bases dark and sinister, their tops tinted with shades of red, intensified by that pure reflection of the water? We were scaling rocks that crumbled and let loose stones that crashed down behind us with the muffled rumble of an avalanche. To the right and left were caves and grottos, hollowed in the rocks, gloomy and impenetrable to the eyes. Elsewhere, there had been vast clearings, and I wondered whether I might not suddenly come face to face with some inhabitant of these waters. Captain Nemo kept climbing up the slope. I did not want to be left behind. I followed with assurance. My stick proved most useful to me. One false step would have been dangerous on those narrow passes, flaked on both sides by abysses, and I walked along with a firm step and without feeling the slightest giddiness. Occasionally, I would leap across a crevice whose depth would have made me shrink back had I come upon it in some glacier on land, or I would venture out on some shaky tree trunk spanning a ravine without even looking down, fascinated only by the wild beauty around me. Here and there I could see vast, monumental rocks jutting forward on their craggy, irregular foundations, seeming to defy the laws of equilibrium. From between these rocky fissures, trees sprouted forth like jets under heavy pressure, supporting other trees that in turn supported them. Everywhere, there were natural towers and wide walls that dropped straight down like curtains, or leaned over at an angle that the laws of gravity would have made impossible on land. I was conscious on this difference due to the density of the water. In spite of my heavy apparel, my copper headpiece, and my leaden soles, I managed to scale slopes of impossible steepness, surmounting them, so to speak, with the agility of an izzard or a chamois. I don't know what a chamois is, but I am aware that the description of this excursion under the sea must sound incredible. However, I am a writer whose busyness is to record things that appear impossible, yet are incontestably real. This was not a dream. I saw and I felt what I am describing. 2 hours after leaving the Nautilus, we had climbed above the tree line, and 100 feet above us rose a peak of a mountain, whose shadow was projected by the brightly glowing slope on the other side. Here and there, petrified shrubs traced a perilously zigzag path over a mountainside. Shoals of fish rose from under our feet like birds startled out of fall rushes. The rocky mass was pitted with impenetrable, winding crevices and grottos, deep caves of unfathomable depth, inside which I could hear frightful sounds of movement. My blood froze whenever I saw a huge antenna bearing my path, or a formidable claw closing with a vicious snap in those cavernous shadows. Thousands of little luminous objects sparkled in the darkness. These were the eyes of gigantic crustaceans, crouching in their lairs. Giant lobsters reared up like halberdiers, brandishing their claws with a metallic click, where titanic crabs stood ready menacingly, like so many cannons on their carriages, and frightful octopi lashed about with their intertwining tentacles, like a living thicket crawling with snakes. This is, I feel like, a part of the book where I kind of understand what people talk about when they're like, this book really at its core is science fiction, because it literally is. Like, underwater sea travel, submarines had not been invented yet, right? And I can really see the author here like playing with that like science fiction aspect of it all, but it's funny because it seems so real. But yeah, I wonder if anyone has like gone through in modern like science discoveries and like gone through the book and fact checked like what is true and what is not. Yeah. Anyway. What was the nature of this strange, fantastic world did I not know? To what order did these articulates belong, which used the rocks for a second shell? Where had creation found the secret of their vegetative existence, and for how many centuries had they lived like this, at the very bottom of the sea? But I could not stop to ponder. Captain Nemo, who was familiar with these terrible animals, paid no attention to them. We had reached a first plateau where other surprises were in store to me. Here I saw picturesque ruins which betrayed the hand of man rather than that of the Creator. They were vast heaps of stone that still had the vague outlines of castles and temples, covered with an infinite variety of flowering zoophytes and draped not with ivy but with a thick tapestry of seaweed and fucus. What part of the world was this which had been swallowed by some cataclysm? Who had laid out these rocks and stones which resembled not the dolmens of prehistoric times? Where was I? And where had the whims of Captain Nemo led me? I should have liked to ask him, but since this was not possible, I stopped him and seized him by the arm. But he shook his head, pointing to the summit of the mountain, seemed to say, "Come on, keep coming." I made a final effort, and within a few minutes we reached the peak, which was some 30 feet higher than all the rocky mass we had just left. I looked back at the slope we had just scaled. The mountain rose no more than 700 or 800 feet above the plain, but on the other side it stood twice as high above the floor of the valley and all that area of the Atlantic. As I looked out into the distance, my eyes took in a vast space lit up by a blazing glow. Needless to say, this was a volcano. 50 feet below the summit, a large crater vomited forth a deluge of stone and slag and exuded torrents of lava, which dissolved into cascades of fire in the water all around. In that commanding position, the volcano, like an immense torch, cast a brilliant light on the plain below as far as the eye could see. It is true that this underwater crater threw up lava, but there were no flames, for flames require oxygen found in the air and cannot exist in the water. But streams of incandescent lava can attain a red-white heat, which, when coming in contact with the water, can successfully vaporize. Streams of these vapors and torrents of lava flowed to the base of the mountain, like the eruptions of Vesuvius on another Torre de Greco, which is apparently a city in the Bay of Naples, at the foot of Mount Vesuvius. A little footnote from the author. Down below, before my very eyes, lay the ruins of a submerged city swallowed by the sea. The roofs were sunken, its temples demolished, its arches in pieces, its columns on the ground, but its propositions were clearly outlined, reminding me of the stately architecture of Tuscany. Farther on were the remains of gigantic aqueduct. Here on the encrusted remains of Acropolis, with the floating forms of a Parthenon, the remains of a quay, also vestiges of an ancient port on the shore of a vanished sea, which had given shelter to merchant ships and craft of war. Farther still, the outlines of crumbled walls and long lines of wide, deserted seas, an ancient Pompeii buried beneath the sea. All this was what Captain Nemo had brought me to see. Where was I? Where could all this be? I had to know, regardless of consequences. I felt a sudden impulse to speak, to tear off the helmet I was wearing, but Captain Nemo stopped me with a gesture. He came to me, packed up a piece of chalky rock, walked to a block of black basalt, and scribbled a single word: Atlantis. What a thrill that word gave me. Atlantis, the ancient Meropis of Theopompus, the Atlantis of Plato, the continent whose disappearance had been questioned by Origen, Porphyry, Jamblichus, D'Anville, Maltbrun, and Humboldt, who classed it among the legends, but whose existence was accepted by Pausanias, Pliny, Amminus, Marcellinus, there's a lot of words, Tertullian, Engel, Scherer, Turifont, Buffon, and D'Azic. There it was before my eyes, majestic evidence of its tragic fate. Atlantis then was beyond Europe, Asia, and Libya, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Atlantis, where the Atlanteans had dwelled, against whom the Greeks had waged their first wars. Plato himself was a historian who described the events of those historic times. His dialogue between Timasius and Critias was inspired, so to speak, by Solon, the poet and legislator. One day, Solon was conversing with some elderly sages from Sais, an ancient city then 800 years old, verified by the annals engraved on the scared walls of its temples. One of these wise old men told the story of another city that was 1,000 years older. This first Athenian city, Sais, 9 centuries old, had then been invaded and partly destroyed by the Atlanteans. These Atlanteans, he said, occupied a vast continent, larger than Africa and Asia put together, extended from the 12th degree of latitude to the 40th degree north. Their dominion even extended as far as Egypt. They had wanted to impose their rule on Greece, but had to withdraw because of the indomitable resistance put up by Hellenes. Centuries went by. Then a terrible cataclysm, accompanied by floods and earthquakes, occurred, and within 24 hours the whole continent of Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea. Only its highest peaks, the Madeiras, the Azores, the Canaries, and the Cape Verde Islands, remained above the sea. Such were the historical memories that word written by Captain Nemo evoked in my head. Here I was, by the strangest destiny, setting foot on one of the mountains of that continent. With my hand, I was touching those ruins thousands of centuries old, contemporary with geological times. I was treading the same ground where the contemporaries of the first man had trodden. My heavy boots were crushing the skeletons of animals of prehistoric times, which had basked in the shade of these trees, now petrified. Ah, why had I so little time? I should have liked to descend the steep slopes of this mountain, explore the whole of this immense continent, which doubtless joined Africa to America, and visit its great antediluvian cities. Perhaps before my very eyes, I should see the warlike city of Makimos and the pious Asubis, whose gigantic inhabitants lived for centuries, and who were powerful, and they could pile up these blocks of stone that still resisted the erosion of the waters. One day, perhaps, some volcanic eruption would bring these sunken ruins back to the surface. Numerous underwater volcanoes may indeed be reported in this part of the ocean, and many ships have been inexplicable tremors that have sailed over these tormented depths. Some have heard rumblings indicated a struggle of the elements going on below, while others have picked up volcanic ash thrown up by the sea. At this point, as far as the equator is still racked by plutonium forces, who knows but what, at some time in the distant future, through the accumulation of volcanic eruptions and of the successive layers of lava, these glowing mountaintops may not appear on the surface of the Atlantic. As I stood there dreaming, trying to fix my mind, all those details of this magnificent landscape, Captain Nemo was leaning on a mossy pillar, motionless and seemingly petrified in mute ecstasy. Was he dreaming of those vanished generations and seeking the secret of human destiny? Was it here that this strange man came to steep himself in memories of the past? Tech, what's up, man? Thanks for stopping by. I'm almost done this page. And then I'll be done with this chapter. Secret of Human Destiny. Was it here that the strange man came to steep himself in memories of the past and revealed the life of antiquity? He who would do nothing with the actual world around him? What would I not have given to know his thoughts, to share these thoughts with him, and to understand them? We remained there for a whole hour, contemplating that vast plain illuminated by the brilliant glow of the lava, which at times became surprisingly intense. At times, the vibrations of internal convulsions made by the slope of the mountain tremble. Rumblings emanating from the deep, transmitting clearly by those crystal waters, reverberating with majestic sounds. And then the rays of the moon pierced through the waves and cast their pale shadows on that submerged continent. It was only the dimmest light, but its effect was indescribably beautiful. The captain rose, and casting one final glance at that immense plain, he motioned me to follow him. We descended that mountainside quickly. Once across that petrified forest, I saw the searchlight of the Nautilus shining like a star in the distance. We reached the ship just as the first light of dawn was spreading its white glow on the surface of the sea. That was a good chapter. I knew that Arana was not going to run away from the Nautilus, but just imagine if he had and he didn't get to see Atlantis in that chapter. My God. Anyway, I'm gonna take a little rest to chat with you, Tech. But that was the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10. It's called Coal Mines Under the Sea. So feel free to sit back and relax and listen to these soothing words of this chapter of these next 11 pages. Interruptions completely allowed. Okay. On the following day, February 20th, I rose very late. The fatigues of the previous day caused me to sleep until 11 o'clock. I dressed quickly. I was anxious to find out what direction the Nautilus was going. The instruments told me that she was still heading south at a speed of 20 miles an hour. Oh, wait. I wanted to cut the music for this last chapter because I realized I wasn't supposed to have it on in the beginning of the stream. Okay, I'm going to start over. On the following day, February 20th, I rose very late. The fatigues of the previous day caused me to sleep until 11 o'clock. I dressed quickly. I was anxious to find out what direction the Nautilus was going. The instruments told me that she was heading south at a speed of 20 miles an hour and a depth of 300 feet. Conseil came in. I told him about the nocturnal excursion, and since the panels were open, he could still catch a glimpse of the submerged continent. Actually, the Nautilus was grazing the plains of Atlantis barely 30 feet above the soil. She was gliding along like a balloon swept by the wind on sand. However, in that room, we were more like passengers on an express train. The first objects that passed before our eyes were some fantastically chiseled rocks, forests of trees that had been transformed from a vegetable to the mineral world, whose immobile silhouettes made wry faces beneath the waves. There were also masses of rocks buried under a tapestry of axides and anemones, bristling with long vertical hydrophytes, then blocks of lava strangely contorted, silent witness of the furies of volcanic eruptions. While gazing at that eerie scenery, brilliantly reflected by our powerful searchlight, I related the story of the Atlantes, who had inspired Bailey, from a purely imaginative point of view, with so many charming pages. I spoke of the wars of these heroic people, and discussed the questions of Atlantis as a man who could no longer doubt its existence. Conseil, however, was distracted and was no longer listening. His indifference to my historical references was evident. I realized that schools of fish were catching his eye, and when fish swam by, Conseil, thoroughly obsessed by a mania for classification, was completely oblivious to the world around him. When this happened, nothing could be done except to follow him and pursue our ichthyological studies together. The fish of Atlantis, however, differed little from those we had already observed. They were gigantic rays, 15 feet in length, possessing enough strength to leap out of the water. Sharks of various kinds, among them all glaucous, 15 feet long, with sharp triangular teeth, so transparent it was almost invisible in the water. Brown-colored sargos, prism-shaped humantins, protected by a tubular hide. Sturgeons, similar to their cousins in the Mediterranean. Oh God, here come the nautical terms. Thank you. I love the iguana icon too. My favorite of the little icons is the little like anatomical heart though that's smiling. That's my fave. A foot and a half long, brownish yellow in color, and the little, yeah, that one. um, Gray fins, lacking teeth and tongue, which glided like a lithe, supple serpents. Among the bony fish, Conseil noted some blackish Macarinus, 15 feet long, armed with a piercing sword in their upper jaws. Bright colored weavers, known in Aristotle's times as sea dragons, dangerous to catch because of the spikes on their dorsal fins. Pricky dolphins with brown backs, stripped with fine blue lines framed in a border of gold. Beautiful Dorado, moonfish that looked like dishes with a touch of blue, and when the rays of the sun fell upon them, shimmered like silver specks. Finally, swordfish, 25 feet in length, swimming in schools with their sickle-shaped fins and their 6-foot swords, intrepid animals, more herbivorous than carnivorous, and, like well-trained husbands, they obey the slightest whims of their females. I love that the author says well trained husbands. What a time to be saying that. Like, oh my God, this book was written in like what? Hold on one second. When was this book written? Looking at the publication. Mm, 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 mm. I don't know. This is not right. Hey Google, when was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea written? Jules 1870. Okay. All right. 1870. I just love that he said well-trained husbands. That makes me so happy. Um, I'll always remember swordfish as well-trained husbands now. These were gigantic rays, 15 feet in length, possessing enough strength to leap out of the water. Sharks of various kinds, among them a glaucus 15 feet long, with sharp triangular teeth, so transparent it was almost invisible in the water. Brown colored sargos, prism shaped humantins, protected by tubular hide. Sturgeons similar to their cousins in the Mediterranean. Trumpet shells, a foot and a half long, brownish yellow in color, with little gray fins, lacking teeth and tongue, which glided by the lithe, supple serpents. Among the bony fish, Conseil noted some blackish machiras, 15 feet long, armed with piercing sword. Oh, wait, I already read this. But while observing these different species of marine life, I did not fail to study the wide plains of Atlantis. Occasionally, Capricornus accidents of the formation of the rock beneath caused the Nautilus to slow her pace, and then she would slip through the narrow gaps between the jutting hills with the grace of a crustacean. If this labyrinth became difficult enough to prevent passage, the ship would rise like a balloon, and having gone over the obstacle, would resume its rapid course a few yards above the floor of the sea. It was an awesome and enchanting voyage, reminding me of a balloon flying through space, except, of course, that the Nautilus passively obeyed every move desired by the helmsman. Toward 4 o'clock in the evening, the ground, which had, for the most part, been composed of thick mud with scattered petrified branches, began slowly to change. It became more rocky and strewn with a mixture of balastic tuff, bits of lava, and sulphurous obsidian of volcanic glass. I thought that the mountainous region would soon replace the wide plains, and, in fact, as the Nautilus sailed onward, I soon saw on the southern horizon a high wall which, it seemed, would block any further progress. Its summit evidently rose above the surface of the ocean. It must have been a continent, or, at the very least, an island, either one of the Canary Islands or one of the Cape Verde Islands. Our bearings had not been taken, purposefully perhaps, and I did not know what our position was. In any case, such a barrier seemed to me to mark the border of Atlantis, of which we had covered but a small area. Night fell. It did not, however, interrupt my observations. I was alone. Conseil had returned to his cabin. The Nautilus reduced her speed, hovered over the tortuous masses below, sometimes brushing the bottoms of the sea as if she wished to come to rest, sometimes rising unexpectedly to the surface. It was then I caught sight of some brilliant stars shining through the crystal waters. They were, to be more precise, 5 or 6 of those stars of the zodiac that hang on the tail of Orion. I would have remained much longer at the window, admiring the beauties of the sea and sky, but the panels closed. Just then the Nautilus had arrived at a sheer face of the high wall. What would she do to overcome the obstacle? I could not guess. I returned to my room. The Nautilus was no longer in motion. I fell asleep with the firm intention of awaking after a few hours' rest. The next morning, at 8 o'clock, I returned to the saloon. I looked at the manometer and realized that the Nautilus was floating on the surface of the ocean. Then I heard the noise of footsteps on the platform. There was no motion, not the usual movement of the waves. I went up the stairway. The hatch was open. But instead of the broad daylight I expected, I found we were in complete darkness. No, not a single star was shining above, and besides, no night had been so utterly dark. I did not know what to think when suddenly a voice said, "Is that you, Monsieur le Professeur?" "Ah, Captain Nemo," I replied. "Where are we?" "Underground, Monsieur le Professeur." "Underground!" I cried. "And the Nautilus is floating on the water?" "Yes, it is floating on the water. But I do not understand." "Be patient a moment, Professor. Our searchlight will brighten up the scene, and if you like things to be clear, you will be happily surprised." I stepped on the platform and waited. The darkness was so intense that I couldn't even see the captain. I looked straight above me, however, and saw a faint glimmer. Something like a dim twilight filtered through a circular opening. And then there was a blaze of light from our searchlight, and its dazzling beam dispelled that glimmer above me. The brilliant light blinded me for a moment. When I opened my eyes, I saw the Nautilus, motionless, floating on a bank, jutting out like a quay. It was floating on the calm waters of a lake enclosed by a circle of walls about 2 miles in diameter and about 6 miles in circumference. Its level, as indicated by the manometer, was the same as the level on the sea. There was, no doubt, a channel connecting it with the sea. The high walls inclining inward from their base formed a vaulted roof, something resembling an immense funnel turned upside above us, with a circular orifice through which I had seen that glimmer of light, evidently daylight. Before examining with care the interior of that enormous cavern, before asking myself whether it was the work of nature or of man, I went over to Captain Nemo. "Where are we?" I asked. "In the very heart of an extinguished volcano," answered the captain, "a volcano whose interior was filled by the sea, following some convulsion of the earth. While you were sleeping, Monsieur le Professeur, the Nautilus cruised into this lagoon through a natural channel 30 feet below the surface of the ocean. Here our Nautilus has a safe, secluded, and mysterious haven, sheltered from all winds and all storms. In there, on the shores of any of your continents or any of your islands, a haven and a refuge so completely sheltered from the fury of tempests." "I see." "Oh, indeed," I replied. "You are quite safe here, Captain Nemo. What have you to fear in the heart of a volcano? But didn't I see an opening at the top of this dome?" "Yes, you saw its crater, a crater once full of lava, vapors, and flames, but which now gives us the air we are breathing." "But where is this volcanic mountain located?" I asked. "It belonged to one of the numerous small islands which are scattered about this area. Just a rock in your ships, but for us an immense cavern. It was by chance that I discovered it, but fortune served me well." Is it possible to come through that crater above us? No, Monsieur le Professeur. The internal base of this mountain can be climbed, but only up to 100 feet. Above that, the overhanging walls lean inward and cannot be scaled. I see. Captain, nature serves you well everywhere and always. You are quite safe in this lake, and you alone can visit these waters. But what use is it to all of you? The Nautilus doesn't need a haven. No, it doesn't. Monsieur le Professeur, but it does need electric power. Materials to produce that power, sodium. It needs coal to produce sodium and mines to produce coal. This sea covers entire forests buried in geological past, which were transformed into coal. For me, these former forests are an inexhaustible mine. And where do you get your miners? Your crew, I presume. Precisely. These mines extend out beyond the waves like the coal fields of Newcastle. And here that, dressed in our diving suits, pick in hand, my men dig out coal. I do not need coal from the mines on the continents. When I burn this fuel to make sodium, the smoke escapes through the crater of the mountain, making it look as if it were still an active volcano. Shall we be seeing your companions at work? No, not this time. I am in a hurry to continue our underwater voyage around the world. I have enough reserve here to take care of my present needs. However, it will take a day to get our supply on board, and then we shall be on our way again. If you are interested in exploring this cavern, take a scroll out of the lagoon. It's an opportunity. You shall take advantage of it, Professor. I thanked the captain and went off to find two companions who had not yet left their cabin. I invited them to follow me, but I did not tell them where we were. They came up on the platform. Conseil, never surprised at anything, thought it perfectly natural to wake up a mountain after having slept beneath the waves. But Ned Land only thought was to see if there was a way out of that cave. After breakfast, about 10 o'clock, we went down to the bank. Here we are on land again. Oh, here we are on land again, said Conseil. I don't call this land, replied the Canadian. Moreover, we are not on, we are under. Between the base of the mountain and the waters of the lake outstretched the sandy shore, which measured about 500 feet at its widest point. Along this strand of beach, it was possible to walk around the lake, but the base of the high walls was strewn with jagged rocks and volcanic blocks. And enormous pumice rocks lay in picturesque heaps. All these scattered masses had been smoothly polished by volcanic and subterranean fires, and when the beams of the searchlight fell upon them, they created a resplendent shower of brilliant lights. Mica dust lay along the shore, and when our feet stepped upon it, it also raised clouds of sparks. The ground rose sharply as we drew further away from the edge of the water, and we soon reached some long, winding gradients, steep slopes that slowed our progress. We had to walk carefully along these conglomerates, and there was no cement binding them either, and our feet slipped on the glassy tracklet composed of feldspar and quartz crystals. This granite the volcanic nature of this huge cave was evident. I pointed this out to my companions. Just imagine, I asked them, what this funnel must have been like when it filled to the brim with molten lava. When the level of incandescent liquid rose up and spilled over the orifice of this mountain, just like molten iron overflowing the walls of a furnace. I can well imagine what it was like, replied Conseil, but will Monsieur tell me how this came about, and how the furnace was transformed into the quiet waters of a lake? It is very probable, Conseil, that some convulsions of the earth created the channel used by the Nautilus. The waters of the Atlantic swept into the interior of the mountain. There must have been a terrific struggle between fire and water, a struggle which was won by Neptune. But that was many, many centuries ago, and eventually the submerged volcano was transformed into a peaceful cavern. That is all very well, retorted Ned Land. And it's too bad, for our sake, that the channel the professor is talking about did not appear above sea level. But Ned, replied Conseil, if this passage has not been under water, the Nautilus would not have been able to enter this cavern. And I would add, Ned, that if the waters had not rushed in, the mountain would still be a volcano. So your comments didn't make much sense. Fucking Conseil. My God. We continued climbing. Our paths became steeper and narrower. We had to jump across deep crevices that appeared now and then, and at times we had to work our way around overhanging masses of rocks. Sometimes we had to crawl on our knees to slide on the bellies, but with the agility of Conseil and the strength of the Canadian, we overcame all obstacles. At a height of about 90 feet, the nature of the ground changed, without, however, becoming any easier. The conglomerates and trachyte were followed by black basalt. These boulders lay in rugged, craggy stretches in some places, standing like columns supporting the arches of this huge vault, a magnificent example of natural architecture. Then, between these basalt blocks, long streams of hardened lava wound their way, encrusted with bituminous coal, and here and there stretched wide carpets of brimstone. The stronger light of day, pouring in through the crater above, flooded all these volcanic forms with a faint glow, and remained forever shrouded in the heart of the extinguished mountain. Our upward march, however, soon came to stop. At a height of about 250 feet, we came across an impassable barrier. The interior cove began to overhang, and our ascent became a circular walk inside the mountain. At this point, the vegetable kingdom began to appear, competing with the mineral kingdom. A few shrubs and even a tree sprouted here and there from the crevices in the walls. I recognized some euphorbias with their bitter sap oozing from the trunks, heliotropes scarcely recognizable as such, with their clusters of flowers drooping and somewhat wilted, since the rays of the sun never reached them. An occasional chrysanthemum grew timidly at the foot of aloes, whose long leaves looked sickly with some violets still lightly scented. And I confess I smelled with delight. Fragrance is the very soul of flowers, and sea flowers, as beautiful as may be, have no soul. We reached the foot of a clump of sturdy dragon trees, which had split the rocks with their vigorous roots, when Ned Land suddenly exclaimed, "Ah, monsieur, a beehive!" "A beehive indeed," I commented, with a gesture of utter disbelief. "Yes, a beehive," repeated the Canadian, "and bees buzz around it." I drew near, and had to believe what I saw. There, at the mouth of a hole bored in the trunk of a dragon tree, were thousands of these little ingenious insects, so common throughout the Canaries, and whose honey is very highly esteemed. Naturally, the Canadian wanted to collect his store of honey, and it would have been unreasonable if we stopped him. With the spark of his flint, he lit a small quantity of dried leaves mixed with sulfur, and began to smoke out the bees. The buzzing slowly subsided, and the hive produced several pounds of fragrant honey. Ned stowed it away in his haversack. "I won't mix this honey with the pâté of the breadfruit," he said. "I will offer you a very delicious snack, a delicious steak." "Mon Dieu," replied Conseil, "it's something gingerbread to me." "Forget the gingerbread at present," I said, "and let's continue with this interesting walk." At times, we could turn in our path, and the whole lake spread out before us. The searchlight lighted up its whole peaceful surface. No waves, no ripples played on the waters. The Nautilus lay perfectly motionless. On the platform of the bank, members of the crew were busy working, looking like black shadows, clearly outlined under the brilliant light of the ship. By that time, we were circling the crater that stood above the first rock that supported the vault. I noticed that these were the only representatives of the animal kingdom inside the volcano. Birds of prey hovered and dived here and there in the shadows, or flew out from nests perched on the crags of the rocks. There were white-breasted sparrowhawks and screeching kestrels. Some fine fat bustards scampered around on the slopes as fast as their long legs would carry them. I leave you to imagine why the Canadian's eagerness was aroused by the sight of the succulent game, and why he regretted not having a gun in hand. He attempted to use stones instead of bullets, and after a few fruitless efforts, he finally wounded one of these magnificent birds. He risked his life at least 20 times to retrieve the bird, but in the end, the bird joined honeycombs in his sack. When we then had to return to the shore, since the crest of the cavern had not scaled. Above us, the yawning crater looked like the opening of a large well. We could now see the sky quite clearly, and the saw clouds, driven by western wind, raising the top of the mountain with their misty vapors. This was certain proof that those clouds were not very high, since the volcano did not rise more than 800 feet above the level of the ocean. Half an hour after the latest exploit of the Canadian, we were back on the inner shore. Here, the vegetable kingdom was represented by carpets of sea fennel, a small plant in the shape of a parasol, which makes an excellent preserve. Conseil collected a few bundles of them. As for animal life, there were thousands of shellfish of all kinds: lobsters, crabs, prawns, mussels, spider crabs, gallophides, and a great number of other shells, such as porcelains and cowrie rockfish and limpets. Then we discovered a magnificent grotto. My companions and I found great delight in stretching out on its fine sand. The fire had glossed its enameled walls, which glittered with their sparklings of mica dust. Ned Land chopped those walls and tried to figure out their thickness. I could not help smiling. The conversation then turned to his eternal plans to escape, and I thought he'd given some hope without too much gamble, since Captain Nemo had only come down south in order to renew his stock of sodium. I surmised now that he would coast the shores of Europe and of America, which would permit the Canadian to have more success than his abortive attempt so far. Abortive. We had been searched out inside that enchanting grotto for an hour. Stretched out inside that enchanting grotto for an hour. The conversation, which had been lively to begin with, now began to lag. We were overcome by a certain weariness. Since I saw no reason why I should not take a nap, I let myself fall into a deep slumber. I dreamt, one does not choose one's dreams, that my existence was slowly being transformed into the vegetative life of a simple mollusk, and that this grotto was nothing more than the bivalve of my shell. Suddenly I was awakened by Conseil's voice. "Wake up! Wake up!" cried the worthy lad. "What's the matter?" I asked, sitting up. "The water is rising. We shall drown." I stood up. The sea was surging into our grotto like a torrent, and decidedly, since we were not mollusks, we had to get out. In a few moments we were safe above the grotto itself. "What's going on?" asked Conseil. "Is this a new phenomenon?" "No, my friends, I replied. "It is a tide. It is a tide which almost took us by surprise, like the hero of Walter Scott. The ocean is rising outside and following the natural law of equilibrium. The level of the lake is rising also. We have got off with only half a bath. Let us go and change our clothes on the Nautilus." 3/4 of an hour later, we had finished our circular journey and were on board. The men of the crew had just finished loading the supply of sodium, and the Nautilus could have left immediately. Captain Nemo, however, gave no orders. He was waiting for the night to creep out secretly through his underwater passage. Perhaps. Whatever it was, the following day the Nautilus, having left her mooring, was sailing on the high seas, a few yards below the waves of the Atlantic. Okay, that was chapter 10 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. I like those chapters a lot. There was a little adventure, there was a little mystery, there was learning about this underwater science fiction we have going on. It was lovely. So let's go ahead into Storygraph and mark our page. We are at 317. which means we are 66% of the way through the book. Okay, and with that, I'm going to end this. Okay. Good night.